So it's my pleasure to introduce Eli Finkel, who is, do you have a special title? A
I
named?
don't think so, no.
Okay. Professor of Psychology and Management at the Kellogg School of Business in Northwestern. Eli is unique in that he is probably the preeminent scholar in relationship science and has probably the best book out there on the institution of marriage. Opened my eyes to how the institution of marriage has changed over the last little while, and the huge pressure we're putting on it. Luckily, my wife and I agree that everything, we are an all marriage, not a nothing marriage, so that's nice. But Eli has applied his amazing analytical ability of relationships to politics as well, and has a science paper, right? Just like his first paper on politics is in science. So it's pretty amazing. It's hard not to be envious, but we can all gain from Eli's knowledge today as he tells us about how the Cavalry is not coming and talk about political polarization. So thanks, Eli, for coming.
Thank you for the introduction and for inviting me and for this very cool speaker series you've had. Yeah, I'll launch right in. This is a almost entirely new talk for me. This is my attempt to start piecing together some threads that have been rolling around in my mind. I'm not confident that everything is going to come together coherently. I think there are probably going to be notable flaws in my logic, exceptions to the work that I'm covering and so forth. So I look forward to getting sober criticism of the ideas, but I'm excited to share these thoughts with you. So as Kurt mentioned, I'm a marriage researcher. I mostly throughout my career studied intimate relationships, speed dating, online dating, how people sustain passion over time. These are the sorts of questions that animated me until the last couple of years. And I'm not really going to talk about this book today, other than to say if you want a meaningful life, you should buy several hundred copies for everyone you know. But I just wanted to emphasize one thing that I think informs my thinking about both sides. So as I was working on this book, and I was eating lunch and I was searching Twitter one day in, I think, 2016, and I got this tweet. This tweet came in from the Gottman Institute. John Gottman is the biggest luminary in marriage research. And this tweet says, couples who are demanding of their marriage are more likely to have deeply satisfying unions than those who lower their expectations. Fair enough, right? Like if you don't expect something good, you're not going to get something good. But literally minutes later came this tweet from Esther Perel, who's, a god in her own right. She's not a marriage researcher, but she's certainly a marriage expert. And she says that expectations are resentments waiting to happen. And so one of the things I sought to do with the book is to try to reconcile, well, what do we do with that? Is it that we should have high expectations? Should we not have high expectations? If you want to know the answer to that, read the book. But for now, there was like one basic insider thread that I think was useful as I was writing the book, which is we can ask for whatever we want from our marriage. You want to ask a lot, you want to ask a little, there's pros and cons of both, but there are consequences of those asks. So you might say, well, I want my partner to be my best friend. Well, okay, what does it take to cultivate and sustain a long-term best friendship? You might say, I very much value lifelong monogamy. Okay, what is it going to take for us to make sure that we are fulfilling to each other in terms of romantic and sexual domains, right? Like your expectations determine what is required of you. And so that sort of basic insight is the thread behind the talk today. So I have the talk divided into 5 parts. Last part is conclusion, so that one doesn't take long. But the first part is democracy in America, my perspective on some of the issues in democracy in America. Some of you might be familiar with this famous exchange. The details are a little hazy, but so far as I can tell, this exchange in something approximating the form I'm going to tell you really did happen. So Benjamin Franklin leaves the Constitutional Convention in 1787, and I think the wife of the mayor and a very famous socialite in her own right, Elizabeth Willing Powell, says, what have we got? A republic or a monarchy, right? Like she doesn't know what happened in that room. And he says, a republic if you can keep it. This is a very famous idea. And there's an interesting question, like, what did he mean? Like, what does it mean for him to turn to a citizen of this nation that he literally is like minutes away from building? And he says, if you can keep it, what does he mean by that? Well, I can give you my take, and it is very similar to my take about our expectations or what we're asking from marriage. My take on what he meant, we can ask whatever we want from our political system, but there are consequences of those asks. And let me say that a little bit differently. How can we build and sustain Did somebody say no slides? Oh, you don't see PowerPoint. There is. Oh, wait, there is PowerPoint, and I want to share them right now. It's totally amazing. Here's what you missed. Can you guys see this now? Okay, you missed basically just this. So this is the book you want to buy hundreds of copies of. These are the people who are having the exchange, and now we are here. So, okay, so my take, I just gave you that. So in other words, how can we build and sustain a political system that Abraham Lincoln decades later characterized as a government of the people, by the people, and for the people? In a real way, I know we can quibble about the definitions, but a real way, what Americans tried to do in 1776 and 1787 was pretty new, right? Can we really build a system that is fundamentally of, by, and for the people? And if we're going to do it, what are the demands on the people who are leading that government system? Okay, so look, there's a lot of potential answers to what Franklin meant. I can give you what I think George Washington would have said. Like if I asked George Washington, well, what do you think Franklin meant? I think we have a pretty good idea what he would have said. And we know this from his farewell address. Some parts of this were, of course, canonized in the Lin-Manuel Miranda's recent musical, but there's parts that, this was quite a long speech, actually. So here's the basic idea of the farewell address. He says, to keep the republic, if you can keep it, well, how do you keep it? You have to avoid extreme partisanship. And here's a quote from his address. I'll highlight three separate ideas here to make sure that they're clear. First, what are the problems with extreme partisanship? First, it tends to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. There's a lot of discussion. I could do a whole talk actually using these three things as a springboard to reviewing the literature on partisanship and the consequences. Like we basically have a pretty sclerotic governmental system. It's pretty difficult to get anything done. Not clear that the government even represents the people that well anymore. Second, over here in the yellow, we've got it kindles the animosity of one part against the other, foments occasional riot and insurrection. So in other words, extreme partisanship tends to cultivate hatred, even to the point of violent and perhaps efforts to overthrow standard governmental process. Again, might have seemed a little bit extreme not that long ago, but it doesn't anymore. And then third, this sort of extreme partisanship opens the door to foreign influence and corruption, which finds a facilitated access to the government itself through the channels of party passions. I'm assuming that most of the people on this call know that the primary way in which Russia in 2016 interfered with our election is basically getting us to hate on each other, right? So they basically created a bunch of memes where Democrats hate Republicans and Republicans hate Democrats, and we basically did the work for them. So this is his argument for like, if you can keep it, right? What is required to keep it? Try to avoid the extremity of partisanship. Well, there wasn't really political science and much in the realm of formal social science back in 1796, I believe, when Washington and Hamilton wrote that speech. But now there is a lot of social science on this. And so Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt have this book. I hope if you're serious about these sorts of considerations, you have read it or will read it. It's called How Democracies Die. And they argue that we have this idea of a coup. Like we have an idea of how democracies die, basically in the form of a violent coup. So Pinochet's coup in Chile might be representative. This is 1973. And you can see that he got the military on board and he bombed the presidential palace. But Levitsky and Ziblatt said that's not the way most democracies die these days. Like if you really monitor this across all the nations of the world, across the last several decades, really, that's not the way things work. The way democracies die is through the steady erosion of democratic norms. It's usually democratically elected groups that ultimately end up killing democracy. And they argue, these two authors argue, that there really are two fundamental norms that are essentially required for you to have a functioning democracy. The first is mutual toleration, where you view opposing partisans as legitimate oppositions rather than existential enemies. And second, forbearance, where you adopt the view that just because one has the power to do something doesn't mean that one should, right? There's no way of writing a constitution or a set of laws that can think of every possible way that people can act in bad faith or exert their hand of power over the opposition. There's some norm here that you have to do. And so, for example, examples of ways that you might violate this is court packing, which FDR tried to do in the 30s. There's talk now that the Democrats maybe should try to do now. Gerrymandering, filibustering, corrupt pardons, just on down the list. So in a sense, I think there's pretty decent evidence, at least for some version of Washington's thesis, that the way to keep the republic is to avoid the absolute extremity of partisan passions. Washington went on to say this. I find this interesting. And there being constant danger of excess in light of this extreme partisanship, the effort ought to be by force of public opinion to mitigate and assuage it, mitigate and assuage this level of extremism. A fire not to be quenched, it demands a uniform vigilance to prevent its bursting into flame, lest instead of warming, it should consume. And one thing that I'll talk about in the talk, and this is the idea of the cavalry not coming, is he argues who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for making sure that he argues not only is extreme partisanship the major threat to the nation, but that the people responsible for keeping partisanship in check is the people on this call. It is literally you and I and the other citizens and residents in the nation. Okay, we the people. So let me summarize this first little bit. The idea here is that living in a republic comes with responsibilities. One responsibility is to adhere to and enforce the norms of toleration and forbearance, even for people on the other side whom we vociferously disagree with. And ultimately, responsibility for upholding these norms resides with the populace. Now, let me just say that a lot of you are saying things like social media and elites and so forth. And I'm going to come back to that, right? There are, I think, very viable alternative explanations for other people being primarily or ultimately responsible for this stuff. But I'm making the case today, and I'll come back to it later, that it's really up to us. And that's what George Washington believed from the start. Okay, so what is the state of our partisanship today? Are we indeed polarizing? It turns out to be a much more complicated question than relationships researcher me had any inkling of 3 years ago. So there's a lot of different types of polarization. So basically when political scientists talk about polarization, up until 2012, what they always meant was disagreement about ideology or about policies. That is, do people agree or disagree on the issues? It wasn't until the last decade or so that they started to think seriously about social types of polarization. I'll come back to that too. So are we polarizing when it comes to ideas? It certainly feels like it. Well, it turns out that there's two different ways of answering this question. There's a consistency way of measuring ideological polarization, and there's a divergence way of measuring ideological polarization. I put the name of the political scientist most strongly associated with each camp, but there's whole big literatures on these things. So these are a set of graphs from the Pew Foundation, the Pew Research Center. My guess is that a lot of you have seen this already. And these graphs say, my goodness, look at how much we are polarizing. But actually, just to be clear, what those graphs measure is not the extent to which we disagree about stuff, but rather the degree to which we fall into coherent buckets. So if I have the liberal position on abortion, do I also have the liberal position on the death penalty, right? And so you can actually make a distinction between, like, if I'm like a little liberal on something, am I also likely to be a little liberal rather than conservative on the other thing? And the answer is yes, that we really have shifted as a society such that we're sort of on one side or on the other side of these issues. But if you wanted to think about extremity, right, that really what we have is like a whole bunch of people who are extremely liberal and a whole bunch of people who are extremely conservative, you would expect different graphs over here on the divergent side. So this is people who identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative. This is the extent to which you see any sort of bimodality in the way people identify, and basically you're not seeing it at all. Let me just say one thing that isn't really about temporal shifts, but was a recent article that maybe some of you saw and that I found interesting. This is an article from last year, taking data from the Pew Research Center, I think 40,000 people, something like that, across a bunch of nations. And it just asks this question. Okay, well, there's a lot of views about various moral issues around the globe: abortion, alcohol use, divorce, affairs, homosexuality, premarital sex. There's a big range of views about those things. How different are Democrats and Republicans from one another relative to how different, like, two randomly selected countries will tend to be? And you can see here that there's meaningful differences, right? Nobody will say that Republicans and Democrats agree on everything. So to what degree, like, how can we contextualize how much they disagree? Well, this paper does something interesting. It says, well, let's take the range of views about these 8 moral issues that exist in the globe and evaluate the extent to which Republicans are similar versus different on a spectrum that includes the full range of these ideas around the globe, right? And what you can see is, and I don't know whether you think this is high or low, but you can see that Democrats and Republicans tend to be more similar than 70% of cross-national comparisons. That's collapsing across all of the issues and all the possible bi-national comparisons and so forth. But my reading of that, you might differ in terms of your interpretation, is that if you think about the range of moral variation that can agree on these issues, that there's reasonable overlap between Democrats and Republicans in their actual beliefs. This is at least consistent with the idea that a lot of our fighting might not be so much about the ideas themselves. Well, what might they be about? Look, we obviously do have some fights about ideas, but there might be something else going on. And I would argue that this other thing that's going on is a much bigger source of our divergence, of our hatred, than differences over ideas and policies. So the second one we've called political sectarianism. Rachel and Kurt, you've just written a paper that talks about affective polarization. There's a bunch of different names for overlapping ideas. This was our first paper. I spearheaded it with Jamie Druckman here at Northwestern. But what you can see is that this is like an all-star team of people that got together to say, well, what is it that we think we know across 6 disciplines about the nature of this other type of polarization, like polarization other than disagreeing about ideas? You could call it social, you could call it affective. We called it sectarianism. By the way, this was the issue of science that was on the newsstands as Americans were going to vote in last year in the big presidential election. We argue that political sectarianism has 3 core components. Othering, that is a very strong us versus them mentality. Aversion, it's not just that it's us and them. Like, I'm pretty different from the Inuits. I'd say that's strong. I'd be high on othering, but like, do I dislike them? No, I don't dislike the Inuits. So it's also this part, but it's not just that they're different and you dislike them, you think they're bad in a moral sense, right? And it's the 3 of those things that in combination that we've argued is especially dangerous. Okay, alongside this, so we have ideological polarization, we have this thing that we're calling political sectarianism, some type of social polarization. And what we present in that paper, we present a couple of graphs, and we show that on this feeling thermometer from 0 to 100, basically people haven't shifted in terms of their feelings for their own side very much. They've been in the 70 to 75 range, Democrats, Republicans alike. So calling it polarization is a little bit misleading, because it implies that 2 things are happening, but really only one thing is happening, which is we have become much more hateful toward people on the outside. And you can actually compare, so how much more positive am I than I am negative, or how much more negative am I toward the other side than I am positive toward my own side? And so we made this graph. And for a while there in the 80s and the 90s, there was a definite trend such that we favored our own side more than we hated the other side. That trend is over, at least for the time being. And we're seeing, so far as I can tell, there is no reason to believe that this won't continue getting lower and lower. Like, the feelings toward the other side are getting increasingly frosty, feelings toward our own side are not getting any more positive. And so we've come to this point of extreme negative partisanship. We actually hate the other side more than we like our own side. And this negative partisanship, that is our political identity defined in large part by what we're against, the extent to which we're against the other party, the consensus that we can reach about how bad the people on the other side are, that's become increasingly influential in our voting behaviors and our party loyalty. It's why if you turn on MSNBC or Fox News, you see a whole lot of discussion about the latest outrage from the other side. Turns out to be a lot easier to get Democrats to agree on how awful Donald Trump is than to get Democrats to agree on exactly what should be taught in schools, right? Like, figuring out exactly where we agree and disagree on the left is trickier than figuring out how we hate the grievously horrible person on the other side. So with that, you get this extreme party loyalty. So this is Abramowitz and Webster. They're the ones who coined the term negative partisanship. This is the correlation between the Democratic share of the House vote and the Democratic share of the presidential vote in contested elections. To some degree, this is a measure of straight ticket voting. Now, I know that those of us who vote in the US or are aware of how the US works, we're not surprised to know that party is a significant indicator of what we do. It certainly doesn't have to be, right? It could easily be the case that's like, look, I care about the individual politician, and from one election to the next, it's like I pay attention to the issues and I see which ones matter to me. And to some degree, that was happening in the 70s. Where the correlation was in the 0.5 range, but now it's almost impossible to tell whether people are voting for their local House representative or whether they're voting for the president, because if you vote Democrat for one, you vote Democrat for the other. If you vote Republican for one, you vote Republican for the other. There used to be like local issues and local elections. Those are mostly gone these days. It's all national. Okay, so this is something I don't know that anyone's reported this anywhere. I just calculated these results. So this is the percent of the two-party vote for Trump in 2016 and 2020. Now, this is a case where I actually sort of wish I'd set up in advance a poll. So there's been a lot of discussion about how 2020 was different from 2016. First of all, a different person won. Secondly, like, Cuban Americans in Miami-Dade County shifted strongly to the right, as did some people, in southern Texas. And then, but the suburbs went further to the left. We've all, if we pay attention to politics, we've all heard these narratives. What do you think the correlation was between Trump's share of the two-party vote in 2016 and Trump's share of the two-party vote in 2020? Now, I'm not actually taking a vote, so you can't actually do it, but I want you to give some thought. Is it like 0.5? Is it 0.75? Is it 0.9? Is it higher than 0.9? Like, what is the correlation between those two things? Well, so this is, if you plot counties, there's over 3,000 counties in the US. If you plot them by the percentage of that Trump won, you get like DC over here, and I don't know, somewhere in Arkansas, maybe over here, somewhere in the South over here. And you get this pattern. It's not linear, but you get this pattern of the percent that he won. Now let's look at 2020. Okay, that looks pretty similar, but there's a lot of error. It turns out if you do the math and you just do, I understand there's nonlinearities in the data, it is 0.99, which suggests that with everything we're talking about the shifting electorate, and granted, there was much larger turnout in 2020 than there was in 2016. But with all this conversation, basically you could predict almost perfectly what a county was going to do, that is proportion for Trump versus Clinton, proportion of Trump versus Biden, from looking at either one of the other elections. We could predict the Biden percentage exactly almost from the Clinton percentage, right? Not much is changing. So let me summarize this second point. A divided nation. So there's not much increase in ideological divergence. So it's not like people are increasingly becoming bimodal, that half the people, or that some people are super liberal, some people are super conservative. If you look at the electorate as a whole, there hasn't been much shift. There's a large increase. There's a large increase in political sectarianism, this more social, affective, hateful type of partisanship, and negative partisanship, the extent to which we basically our behavior is largely determined and even controlled to some degree by what the other side is doing. And there is immense party loyalty and consistency across election cycles. Again, this is not necessarily the case. The correlations in the 70s between the House vote, voting Democrat in the House, voting Democrat for the president was 0.5 something. Now it's almost 1.0, right? It's almost, I think it's 0.94 over the last decade. All right. I have a question that I don't know how often this gets posed. I mean, Kurt, forgive me if this gets posed all the time and I'm just new to it. Actually, Kurt, I'm curious about this. For me, the interesting question is not why do we have political violence, but why don't we have political violence? Kurt, are people asking that in this space?
Not as far as I know. I mean, the assumption is that reasonable people aren't violent, but I don't think anyone has really thought about that paradigm.
I think the assumption is that reasonable people fight for the things they care about, and sometimes they have to fight hard if they care enough. Anyway, let me just pose this question to everybody on the call. Like, I really am struggling to find out why there's not more violence than there is. So the first thing I want to say, and again, I think this generally gets ignored, to my knowledge, at least in the psychology, and I think the moral psychology, and in general the sort of political psychology worlds, to my knowledge, is that our elections are increasingly hanging on a knife's edge, right? So I just want to show you this. So I went and tracked down the data for this. This is presidential popular vote percent. I know this is not what we talk about. We talk about the Electoral College and anti-democratic tendencies, and we talk a lot about this stuff. But how often are we talking about, well, okay, what's happened with the popular electoral, the actual vote share, two-party vote share over time? So I have the last 100 years. This is 26 elections from 1920 to 2020. Let's start with Biden. So Biden won over Trump by 4.5%. And I think there's a couple things that we can highlight about this that I want to underscore. The first is this: if you look at this century, you can cut these things off in various places, but 2000 to 2020, what is that? That's 6 elections, and Biden's was the second largest. So of the 6 elections, well, I guess of the other 5 elections, only one of them, I guess that would be 20%. So one of the 6 had a margin bigger than 4.5%. Let's look at the previous, I'm losing the math here, the previous 20 elections, I think. So here, 80% had a margin larger than Biden's, larger than 4.5%. And of that 80%, the average margin was 16%. What that means is, like, going to the polls, people kind of knew. I get that polling wasn't always perfect and so forth, but these things weren't close. I mean, 1960 was close. You can look at certain years, but in general, it wasn't at all weird to have 20, 25% victories, but you're not seeing that anymore, right? And so this is the trend line over time. Like, if you want to plot it, it's a little confusing whether you should plot these cases where Bush and Trump won while losing the popular vote. It doesn't matter. The line is obviously not much altered by which way you plot those things. And basically what you're seeing over the last 100 years in the presidential elections is that there used to be large margins. There also used to be high variance that, for example, here we had the Republican winning by 17%, and then the next election, the Democrat won by, that was an extreme case because that was the Great Depression. But these sorts of shifts were not that rare, right? Where you'd get a pretty robust victory for one side followed by for the other side. Here we had it, in 64, we had a 20-some point win for the Democrats, and then 2 election cycles later, this is Nixon, 20-some points for the Republican. And so now what we have is these elections are hanging on a knife's edge. Well, there's good political science on that. So, well, what does it mean if each election is, just a little bit more effort from your side, a little bit more getting out the vote, a little bit more persuading people in the middle, like fractional, might tip power in the White House, might tip power in the Senate or in the House of Representatives? Well, there's a lot of good political science on this stuff in the last 5-10 years. And what it says is things get crazy, right? If the balance of power is hanging on a knife's edge, people become willing to do all sorts of things other than try to govern effectively. Okay, so alongside this knife's edge state of our politics, by the way, you probably don't need me to remind you that the Senate is literally 50-50. Democrats have, I think, a 3-seat majority in the House. Like, it is unbelievably close. And if 3 states, you guys may or may not know this, 3 states that were won by, I think, 0.6% or less had gone to Trump over Biden, Trump would be president. Like, this is how close our elections are these days. We, alongside that, sense that, every election hangs on a knife's edge, are the stories that we tell ourselves. Are they true? Are they false? I don't know. I'm not making an evaluation. I'm just saying these are the narratives we have. If the wrong candidate wins this election, this is a couple weeks before Trump-Biden, America will never recover. Green is the people who agree, and black is the people who disagree. I cut off so this is the 70% mark. So it's something like 76% of Democrats said America will never recover if Trump wins. By the way, I'm guessing a lot of liberals still think that's true. I think it's 65% of Republicans said if Biden wins, America will never recover. These are the stories that we tell ourselves going into these elections. This is a famous finding from Calmo and Mason, still unpublished, I believe, but it's a conference presentation from a couple of years ago. So they say, is it that, would you say that you basically sort of disagree, or would you say that the other side is a serious threat to the viability of the nation? Democrats and Republicans basically agree. Almost half, or certainly over 40% of Democrats and Republicans say that people on the other side are literally downright evil. So this is Mo Brooks, the Trump video from January 6th. Let me give you Mo Brooks. He was before Trump that day. He says, today, Republican senators and congressmen will either vote to turn America into a godless, amoral, dictatorial, oppressed, and socialist nation on the decline, or they will join us and they will fight and vote against voter fraud and election theft and vote for keeping America great. I mean, holy shit, right? Why would we not be violent? Are these honestly the stakes? A godless, amoral, dictatorial, oppressed, and socialist nation on the decline, where the only reason why you'd actually be losing it is because of voter fraud and election theft. I don't know why the question is why these people are violent. If you believe this, I'm not at all surprised that you're violent. Now, look, I don't want to, I'm going to come to false equivalence in both sides in a minute, but do I think the right has, cornered the market on rather fundamentalist and extreme existentialist perspectives on what's going on here? So this is Rebecca Solnit, a totally sober intellectual thinker, somebody I admire. This is in Literary Hub, not exactly Breitbart, and she says, the title is "On Not Meeting Nazis Halfway," and so. She says here, when Trump won the 2016 election, and she can't help herself by saying, while losing the popular vote, the New York Times seemed obsessed with running features about what Trump voters were feeling and thinking. These pieces treated them as both an exotic species and people it was our job to understand. Understand being that word that means both to comprehend and to grant some sort of indulgence to. So she doesn't want us doing that. And she can't resist saying appeasement didn't work in the 1930s and it didn't work now. And don't forget the title of her piece is "On Not Meeting Nazis Halfway." So look, is that identical to what Mo said on the previous slide? I don't know. I don't really know. And is she right or wrong? I'm not adjudicating it. I'm just saying if I believed the strong version of these things, I'm not sure that I would be totally opposed to political chicanery and violence. Let me say something about both sidesism. Believe me, all of you are thinking it anyway. In America today, both sides are guilty of democracy undermining behavior, including political violence. If you want me to give examples on both sides, I can give them to you. In recent decades, Republicans have been worse. That is, the Republican elites in particular have been worse in terms of their violations. But it is ahistorical to claim that Republicans have always been worse. And it is most likely ahistorical to say that Republicans always will be worse. Right? If you want to go back to who was doing violent bombings in the 1970s, it was mostly on the left. If you want to go back to, the most extreme left-wing group ever is probably the USSR. They pulled some chicanery as well. So let me just ask you, those of you on the left, which, given base rates, could be more than half of you, if the truest story of America is one of the truest one, right? This is like at its essence what America is one of genocide and grievous and ongoing racial oppression. And if the next election will determine whether the undeserving racists will be able to destroy the vestiges of American democracy to ensure their permanent grip on their ill-gotten privileges, why are we not sacrificing democratic principles? Who cares? If those are the stakes, why should we care about gerrymandering? Of course we should gerrymander. And violent protest? Of course we should have violent protest. Okay, so why not violence? The summary, so views about the turpitude of opposing partisans and the stakes of the next election are extreme. By the way, I think the stakes of the next election really are extreme because of that knife's edge, the knife's edge point that I showed you with data. And the stories that we tell ourselves, again, they may be true. I'm not judging whether they're true or false. I'm just saying, for me, if everything hangs on this next election, the future of the republic, the ability ever to have a democracy again before they, change all the voting rules, like if these are the stakes, I don't know what to say. I would support some violence. I would support some political chicanery. So if that's what I'm saying here. If those are the stakes, what's wrong with, suppressing some votes on the other side? Really? Like those are the stakes and we're going to get all hot and bothered about some principle and a little violence here and there. All right. Third, this is the last of my major points. Then I've got the discussion or the conclusion, and I think I've left some time for Q&A, unless I've been canceled by then, which is also possible. Okay, a distorted lens, right? So I've now talked about the existential language that activists, but many of us who are politically attentive, politically sophisticated, and read our news and perhaps watch our YouTube or watch our cable news and so forth, have the privilege of having a YouTube or a Facebook algorithm feeding stuff to us. So we've talked a little bit about the stories that we're telling. To what degree are our assumptions about the other side accurate? Right? It's actually kind of a big deal, right? So if I think I know what the other side believes and what policies they favor and what they're likely to do, that should inform my behavior regardless of whether I'm right or wrong. But it turns out that whether I'm right or wrong is consequential in terms of me making wise decisions. So, I just basically cherry picked a few findings from this literature. Well, I didn't cherry pick this. This actually is the first president of the United States by any measure. So he argues, and I glossed over this before when I quoted from him earlier about how terrified he was of political factions. He argued that a lot of the fighting is ill-founded and based on false alarms. I glossed over that before. Is that right? Because if we really have these massive disagreements and we see them honestly, it may well be worth very serious fighting. Yes, maybe including compromising democratic norms. Yes, maybe including violence, right? There are some standards on which many of us would actually be willing to do that. So, but it's important to know, like, are our assumptions about the other side accurate? So I basically cherry picked 3 examples here. The first is, this is one of the earliest studies. I didn't even know about this one, so I credit my co-authors. I'll get to them in a little bit for helping bring this to my attention. But so this is a policy question, right? So in this study, imagine that you're a participant. This is a study that was published in the year 2000, and imagine that you're told stories about people who are in a state of need. They've had serious afflictions against them. One caught AIDS, one is unemployed, one has severe obesity. They're in difficult circumstances, and they have various conditions in this study. The condition I'm showing you is a story about how they are at fault, right? That is, or at least plausibly, at least partially at fault. So for example, they lost their job because they just don't have good work habits. Well, so to what degree, if you are a Democrat or if you're a Republican, to what degree do you think that you should give assistance to these people? Like, how much should you be taking care of them economically? Well, there are differences here, right? So liberals actually reporting about themselves, care a little bit more. They favor giving assistance more than conservatives do. That's a real, truthful difference. And frankly, the sort of difference that I want society to have differences about and debate. Right? These sorts of fights are good. Like, how should we deal with situations like that? But this is our perception, right? So this is what Republicans think, what conservatives think about liberals. This is what, did I get that right? Yeah, liberals think about conservatives. And so I just, in preparation for this talk, came up with a metric for this, which I'm calling the distortion ratio, right? So basically a distortion ratio of 4 in this case, right? So the difference between 5.19 and 3.86 is a certain size. I think it's like 1.3 something. The difference between 7.7 and 2.5 is something. This difference is about 4 times larger than this difference. How about dehumanization? So this is a terrific recent paper by Samantha Moore-Berg and her colleagues. This is a little bit more complicated. They used Noor Katali's, I think at this point, famous measure of dehumanization. Don't even get me started on the debates about dehumanization happening in this speaker series. But broadly speaking, right, you can say that, Noor and colleagues created this measure called the ascent of man, ascent of human measure, where, like, to what degree do you think of, if you're an Israeli settler, to what degree do you think Palestinians are, sort of like this guy or like sort of like this guy? And so what happens in this study from Samantha Moore-Berg and colleagues is they have people rate their own party and then their view of the opposing party. Look, there is real dehumanization happening here. I have it coded so that higher scores is more dehumanization. They don't dehumanize themselves very much, Republicans. They do dehumanize Democrats much more. That's a big deal. That's a big difference. Here's the perception. That is the meta-perception. So this is the perception that Republicans have of how Democrats view Democrats. This is Republicans, the perceptions that Republicans have of how Democrats view Republicans. Do you follow this? So this is the difference. And this is Republicans' dehumanization of their own group, dehumanization of Democrats, Republicans' perceptions of Democrats' dehumanizations of themselves, and Democrats' dehumanization of Republicans. I know that's a lot of moving parts. I'm going to be brief about this. I'm going to tell you that the Democrat and the Republican effects are basically exactly the same. That is, participants who are Republicans, participants who are Democrats are showing basically the same pattern. And here you have a distortion ratio of something like 2.6. That is, there is a meaningful difference in how much people dehumanize the other side versus their own side, but their perception of how much the other side dehumanizes them relative to dehumanizes itself is about 2.5 times or 2.6 times larger. Again, if that's what you guys want to ask me about in a bit, feel free. There's a lot of bars in that slide. It is yet another case where when we think about how much they dehumanize us, we are grossly, severely wrong in how much they do. They do dehumanize us, but nowhere near as much as we think. And here I'm getting to my colleagues. This is ongoing research with Amy Gordon, Maria Luciano, I don't know the exact pronunciation, I'm realizing, and Catherine Garton. Catherine, by the way, Kurt is now your colleague at UNC. She's leading, I think, Barb Fredrickson's lab. Anyway, we've done some research lately where we've tried to look at this issue. And in particular, we looked at this within the context of Shalom Schwartz's universal values. These are values that have been identified and validated across cultures, not within the context of American politics or anything. But Schwartz argues, I think he now says there's like 19 of them, but for a long time he was saying there's like 10 basic values. Universal human values is the label he uses. Power, so to what degree do you want social power, authority, and wealth? Achievement, right? You can go down the list. It actually, the details I'm happy to come back to. It's not the main point I want to underscore here, but there's a range of these things, and he argues that these, or at least he was arguing for a long time, these are the big 10. Well, we can ask people, right? To what degree do you value each of these things? And so we recruited 500 Democrats. And I have coded this such that, you know, the ones that Democrats don't like as much are on the left, the ones that Democrats like a lot are on the right. And what you can see is that, you know, this is how much Democrats value these various things. They value benevolence a lot more than power, for example. This is what Republicans value. Now, it would be easy for us to cherry pick something and say conformity, you know, they value that more, and, you know, universalism, Democrats value that more than Republicans do. But I just want to underscore that the correlation here is positive and highly positive. So we have a correlation in the 0.5, 0.6 range such that the truth, when Democrats say what they themselves value and Republicans say what they themselves value, the correlation is positive 0.5, 0.6. That is, the profile among these universal human values is very, very similar for Democrats and Republicans. But consistent with the previous couple of slides, we also looked at their projections. So if you were a Democrat, to what degree do you think Republicans value these things? Now, this line that I've showed you here, I just reproduced it from the graph on the left. But now, instead of having what Republicans actually value, we have what Democrats say Republicans value. So in contrast to the case where Republicans, you know, most important value is benevolence and least important value is power, you basically get the exact inverse of that. And a 0.72 is an astonishing correlation, especially when you contrast it with the truth. Right? These are not small effects. How about for Republicans? Again, here I've just reproduced what Republicans actually value. Here's Democrats' perceptions. They're not quite as egregiously wrong, but they are still very egregiously wrong in terms of, you know, the degree to which they think Republicans care more about some value than some other value. The reason why these things are so significant, this is a report from Pew just before the 2020 election, right? Is what people think the other side thinks about things. The values that they think the other side holds are highly consequential in terms of predicting their behavior and how they want to treat the outside group. So the title here is only about 1 in 5 Trump and Biden supporters say they share the same core American values. So here we have, for example, not only do we have different priorities when it comes to politics, we fundamentally disagree about core human values. Something like 80% of people in both camps say that, rather than we have different priorities when it comes to politics, but we share a fundamental commitment to the same core American values. I mean, the exact study hasn't been run, but based on our data, I think these are distortions. I think if you said, please rate the values that you think are core American values, and then project onto the other side, you would project them to be basically Satan worshipers, and in fact, they would basically agree with you. All right, so the summary of point 4. We have extremely inaccurate perceptions of opposing partisans, policy preferences, views about us, and basic human values. We basically, on the values thing, we're basically pretty much the same, and we think we're the opposite. It is a mammoth effect. So is it possible that we're fighting phantoms, right? That this hatred and vitriol that we have is predicated to a large extent on a total distortion of what people actually think and believe. Conclusion. Okay, I want to touch on alternative explanations, right? So there are many of these. I'll just hit on a few. I have made the case that ultimately it's up to us. In fact, I didn't totally make that case. I've made the claim that it is up to us. George Washington also made that claim, that if we're going to fix this, it's up to us. But there's other possibilities. Maybe it's elites. Political elites are the ones who are fundamentally responsible for this. And by the way, this is a great book, but I think it's basically right to list Gingrich as the biggest villain in the whole coarsening of the discourse. And so maybe that's the case, right? So really it's political elites. It's not us. They are fundamentally responsible. And I guess what I would say to you is, why are political elites doing what they're doing? It's hard to imagine that the explanation for that isn't because we like it, because it gets them elected. How about Facebook and Twitter, right? They're feeding us such angry vitriol. Why do they keep doing that? Those jerks. They're doing it because we like it, because it's what we retweet. We like to vilify people on the other side. I mean, Billy Brady, Jay Van Bavel, other people have been doing a lot of research on this and demonstrating that, man, do we love it when somebody on our side calls somebody on the other side evil. We will retweet that till the cows come home. How about gerrymandering? How about these structural fixes, right? Like the psychologists, you get out of the room. This is all about structural fixes. How are the structural fixes going to happen? How are we going to get gerrymandering commissions that will make everything neutral and fair, whatever that means? We can't, because the people who are in a position of power like their position of power, and they elect certain sorts of political candidates who then keep these things intact. Again, not 100% of the time, but for me, ultimately, and I'd love to hear people critique this claim, ultimately, it's about us. That's what it means when Ben Franklin says, if you can keep it. That's what it means when George Washington says, we have to check ourselves. Okay, so where from here? Look, there's a lot of things. I mean, maybe it'll be civil war, or maybe we'll find some way to split in a civil way. I have no idea what that might look like. But look, one possibility is electoral victory. This is the best case scenario, right? This is the scenario in which democracy actually functions. One side just wins the argument. Now, I don't know. I certainly hope that's my side, and popular sovereignty doesn't always have the most perfect track record, but this is the best case scenario, all things considered. There's also undemocratic conquest. I think that there are vast efforts along these lines. Again, here, I think Republicans are worse than Democrats, especially Republican politicians. There is a lot of effort being made right now to minimize the fairness of the vote and other sorts of factors that are related to fair play in a democracy. And look, I could talk more about what I think this might look like. There's the possibility of enlightened disagreement. When people say like, oh my God, we disagree about everything. I wish we could just agree about more stuff. I don't feel like that at all. Disagreement is the lifeblood of democracy. Argument is the lifeblood of democracy. And some people will say, well, why can't we just be civil? I don't even think I care that much about that one. Civility is good. I'd rather have civility than not civility. But if civility is an end, like we're seeking civility, no, give me racial justice, right? I'll take other things over civility. Now, civility might be a means, the means through which we can actually have the discourse we need to have, in which case I care a lot about civility. But I think broadly, these are three of the plausible ways to go. And I mean, one of them is quite bad, and I'm fearing that we are way down that road. Okay, so my perspective, we're on a bad road. I don't totally know where the off-ramps are. I really, I'm totally concerned, and I'm worried that we are in a cycle that's making the situation worse and worse and worse. I do think that having a president who is not leaning into the culture wars as much as, say, Trump did is probably beneficial, but I don't think he's reversing much. Seeking common ground on the process of politics does not imply centrism or compromise on its content, and the pursuit of common ground must be mutual. It's not really fair for one side just to lay down its arms while the other side is breaking out the nukes. But perhaps more than anything, and this is the claim that I'm making today, it's up to us. So this is Louis Brandeis, famous for a lot of things, not least of which is the first Jewish Supreme Court justice. And he argues, and I think I believe him, that the most important political office is that of the private citizen. All right. I think there's time for Q&A if people have questions.
Great, thanks so much, Eli. Any questions? Oh, Farouk, all right.
I wanted to ask something about, Democrats and Republicans' distorted view of each other. I kind of disagree with what you have said, because although people may agree on some of the core values, that doesn't mean that, they're disagreeing about how those core values reflect themselves on issues at hand, the real world issues. For instance, all Republicans may think that the freedom of expression is, a fundamental right. It's their core value, but they might not think that that should extend to matters of national security. Or maybe Democrats think that the right to live is not relevant in the context of abortion. Maybe they have some, let's say, nuanced opinions about that specific context, but they all agree on the, let's say, core abstract values. That doesn't mean that they're not that different. But what are your opinions on that?
You are introducing a new hypothesis that would produce some interesting nuance to the conclusions that the current data afford, and I hope you or someone else on this call runs that study.
Thank you.
Eli, I've got a question. Let's say you write a book on this, and now everyone knows you read. It's a New York Times bestseller, God willing. and now everyone says, look, it turns out we're not that different. Is that a first step? Is that enough? What?
That's a first step.
Yeah.
I mean, look, I didn't prep for this exact question, but again, I want to underscore that some of the differences that we have, even if they're not as big as we think they are hugely important. Like, we should be debating the nature of our school curricula. I'm glad we're fighting over that. And how we frame what slavery was. Is slavery part of a story of ongoing and relentless oppression? Is slavery something that happened in the past, but it's getting better? We should be debating those sorts of things as a society. And one of the things that makes me bummed out about our political sectarianism is we can't even have the conversations that we need to have about the important differences that actually exist because we're so angry and so vilifying of the other side. So yes, I think what does the other side actually believe is a crucial step and only the first step. And then we need a whole bunch of systems for figuring out how do we make sure that everybody has a voice in our democracy, and what are the systems for adjudicating them? So like, once we have a bunch of perspectives on the table, is it a majority rule? Is there, like, you know, the philosopher king? Like, what are those mechanisms? I don't know the answers to those. I wish those were the sorts of conversations that we were having.
Great. Anne has a question and says, sorry, my mic's broken, so I'm going to type here. I know what your take is on fixing the amount of disagreement. However, do you think that this evidence can inform the development of effective interventions to curb or soften political disagreement?
I mean, let me say there's two questions in there. One is like, what is my current state of optimism about intervention in social science? And I'm on the fence. Like, I'm becoming aware that it's harder than I thought it was 10 years ago and even maybe a few years ago. But yes, I believe there are interventions that can work. I didn't give this talk today, but the hypothetical book that Kurt was talking about that I am working on is a book that applies insights from relationship science, right? Like, you might think that there's nothing in common. Like, what does it have in common? Like a husband and wife or two wives or whatever, they're having some huge fight. A lot of that affect is the same. It's righteous indignation, it's experienced grievance, it's, are we making, in the social psych literature, we talk about positive attributions, right? Like, what is my explanation for why you showed up late is massively important for the quality of the relationship. It turns out that a lot of the things, not all, luckily, it's not like a Republican as a collective needs to have hot sex with Democrat as a collective. So in some sense, our problem is easier. In some sense, it's harder. But a lot of the problems that we have are related to very similar to what is closer to my home base, which is how do people navigate conflict in intimate relationships? And look, it's hard. There is a marital therapy industry. It doesn't always work. It's better than people are better off going to marital therapy than not going to marital therapy. There are things that we know. And when we talk about what they are, it's like, can you try to phrase your understanding of what your husband said? I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Do you think there might be some other explanation, a more generous way of interpreting that stuff? Like, again, we're not talking about Mars and Venus when we think of some of the ideas that I think have hope in the context of intimate relationships and that may well have hope in the context of politics. It's not a one-to-one thing. There are some differences, but there's some overlap too.
Great. Maybe one more question, and this has been a hot button question I know in psychology for some time. Walter asks, do you think the academic conversation in psych would improve if there was more balanced representation between liberals and Democrats?
Liberals and Democrats?
Oh, sorry. That's not a Freudian slip about what psychology is then.
Right.
Between liberals and conservatives, do you think we should have more ideological diversity in psychology?
Yes, but we don't live in a world where we have to prioritize one thing at a time. There are many, like it's how I felt about Ibram Kendi's How to Be an Anti-Racist book. Like, unlike some books like White Fragility, which I did not like very much, I quite liked the anti-racism book. And basically his thesis is everything that you see, everything that happens in your life, every policy, you get to evaluate on a dimension from racist to anti-racist. Well, he's totally right, of course. But then he sort of acts as if that's sufficient to know how to behave. But why don't I do the same thing for, I don't know, climate change or some other value that we might have? I mean, Kurt, I don't know if you read my the papers I had with Eastwick and Rees about the replication crisis and how just focusing on replicability was going to hurt the field because these things inherently involve trade-offs. So yes, I very much value the inclusion of diverse voices. I value them in the way most of us, my fellow lefties in social psychology, value them, but I also value them more broadly than that. So yes, I'd like to hear from conservatives. If there are inherent trade-offs involved in making those voices louder, I would be very happy to considering whether those trade-offs are worth it.
All right, and maybe we got 2 more minutes, so one more question. Rose put a question in the chat just to me, but I think it's probably for you, Eli, so I'm gonna read it. So have you seen shifts in who we are willing to date and marry in terms of political orientation and ideology?
Massive.
Dating apps like Hinge give us the potential to filter out folks based on ideology, and that increases sectarianism.
Yeah, I mean, I don't even find like those data. I can just tell you what they look like. I don't have to see them. I'm positive that those are mammoth, titanic effects. The ones that are, I think, of greater relevant. No, I think they're both relevant. But the trends that people are noticing in political science, and many of you might be familiar with these, is circa 1960. Very few people minded if their kid would eventually marry someone of the political party. Pretty much today, everybody minds. Kurt, how do you feel about your kids potentially marrying a political Republican?
I mean, to be honest, it's going to depend on how they're Republican, what their views are.
Trump supporter?
I mean, depends how strongly they wear the hat.
But anyway, there are massive effects. I mean, I do think an interesting study that needs to be run is people think that they can't be interested in somebody of the other party. We have a whole bunch of research in another context that says that people think they have different preferences in a partner, but then they meet somebody and they actually don't have the preferences they thought they had. That used to be true even about politics. And if that's still the case, then we shouldn't be able to get people to date because they'll rule people out on principle. But if they inadvertently started dating a Republican or a Democrat, they might end up liking the person. My guess is that we have overpowered that politics has become so fundamental to our identities that it's hard to get along across the divide if you are somebody who cares about politics.
Okay, that's a sobering point. I mean, I guess last question before we let you go, that synthesizes your past research. Could you, with all your power for designing speed dating studies, design the biggest, greatest speed dating study of all time, get all sorts of people to fall in love and heal America through love?
Yes.
Excellent. All right, let's give Eli a hand. Thanks so much for coming.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Kurt.